Tonight on Primetime Politics, the NATO outlier.
We're going to do more, but when you're spending taxpayer dollars, you got to do it right. You got to do it well.
The defense minister is forced to defend Canada's military record, called out by U.S. senators for failing to meet the NATO spending threshold, and Canada described by the U.S. ambassador as the outlier in the military alliance for not investing as much as others. Coming up, we'll get reaction from former Chief of Defense Staff, retired General Tom Lawson. Also,
increasing public trust in our democratic institutions is the objective of any government at all times.
As government services become increasingly digitized, we'll speak with the Treasury Board President, Anita Anand. We'll find out what her office is doing to protect the information of millions of Canadians. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. We begin tonight with a debate on Greg Fergus and his future as the Speaker of the House of Commons. Today, the Deputy Speaker, Chris D'Entremont, ruled an ad promoting a night with Fergus was a prima facie breach of MP's privilege. That ad used partisan language criticizing the Conservative leader and Conservative policies. And with the ruling this afternoon, Conservatives were free to raise a motion of privilege. If passed, it would force Fergus out of the Speaker's chair.
The Speaker oversees all kinds of things, including votes in the House of Commons. He oversees the language that's used in the House of Commons. The Speaker oversees all kinds of administration that goes outside of this chamber as well, in terms of the resources that are allocated to different members of Parliament as well. Madam Speaker, the Speaker plays such a central role in defending our democratic institution that if the Speaker is deemed to be partisan in his role, well, Madam Speaker, how can Canadians have any faith in this institution anymore?
Now, this motion of privilege has pushed all other business to the back burner, and those issues will stay there until the motion is voted on later tonight, tomorrow, or in the days to come. A reminder, the Liberal Party has accepted responsibility for the language in the ad. They say it was not Fergus's fault. We are following the story for you. Well, to the defense minister now, as he found himself defending his department's spending plans today, not only answering questions to the Defense Committee about the revised strategy for D&D, but also answering questions about a letter sent by nearly 24 U.S. senators. All of those senators expressed profound disappointment in Canada's failure to meet NATO's 2% of GDP spending threshold. As they note, the commitment would only amount to 1.76% of GDP by the end of the decade, even with the Trudeau government's intention to invest billions. Take a listen now to Bill Blair and how he responded to the criticism.
I was down in Washington 2 weeks ago. I met with the Secretary of Defense. I met with a number of other legislators there as well. And when we talked about Canada's new investment in defense, I think they were very encouraged by it. But in particular, and I don't like to quote him, he speaks well for himself, but the commander of NORAD has talked a lot very publicly about the nearly $40 billion Canada is investing in NORAD modernization, the acquisition of new capabilities, new capital equipment as part of that. And frankly, with the introduction of our new defense policy, again, he was very supportive and even complimentary to the work that we are doing. I think that it's important as well. We acknowledge in our own defense policy update, we're doing a great deal. We have more to do. We're going to do more. But when you're spending taxpayer dollars, you got to do it right. You got to do it well.
Well, to talk about that letter from U.S. senators, we're now joined by retired Lieutenant General Tom Lawson. From 2012 to 2015, he served as Canada's Chief of Defense Staff. General Lawson, good to see you again. Thank you for making the time.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Listen, you know, over the weekend, we heard the U.S. ambassador, and I guess he changed his tune a bit about Canada's NATO commitment because, you know, just a few weeks ago, he said the U.S. is generally happy with the direction they see Canada headed. But in an interview with Global News, Ambassador Cohen this weekend now describes Canada as the outlier in NATO, not one of the outliers, but the outlier on defense spending and failing to have a path to get to that 2% of GDP. I'm wondering, General, what are the implications of that for Canada?
Well, it sounds like the ambassador is maybe working off a new memo that came in over the weekend that's more in line with where the letter from the 23 senators is. I mean, you have to feel for the Canadian government, who really for decades has taken a deep discount in defense, and it really didn't matter too much to our chief allies, largely the Americans to the south, but even our allies in NATO. Everybody recognized that geographically, Canada is well separated from any threats. But that's all changed. And I'm not sure the government was ready for that. That's changed in that geography really doesn't matter nearly as much as the fact that all of these world systems that help provide the wonderful things that we've got and Western nations have in their economy and to live by are all under threat now. So simply having oceans protecting you and friends to the south isn't good enough. And our allies want to know if Canada's serious about defense.
Now, as you noted there, Canada hasn't really kept up to pace in terms of proportionality with the United States when it comes to defense investments. And before becoming CDS, you also served as Deputy Commander of NORAD. So I'm wondering if there were at that time already frustrations being expressed about the investment or lack thereof coming from Canada.
No, not at all. And it always surprised me, even when I was down there as deputy commander, but even in past years when I was posted to Europe and internationally to the United States, that we weren't really under the gun. And I think it was this acceptance that Canada wasn't like the other NATO allies. We were way over across an ocean. We were on the west flank of NATO. But every other one of our NATO allies would have liked to be in the same position of a very low threat. And the Americans never expected much more from the United States than allowing them to fly in airspace for the decades ever since NORAD was stood up. So we were even then, even 10 years ago when I was Chief of Defense, we were being excused in a way that has seemingly come to an end.
Come to an end, as you say. And part of the reason why defense has essentially not been invested in as much is because when it comes to the ballot box, it really hasn't been much of a priority for Canadians. So, you alluded to how the environment, the threat environment has changed for this country. What do you say to Canadians now who are still on the fence or not convinced that there needs to be more investment, criticism from U.S. senators or not?
Right. So, surveys show that more and more Canadians believe that investing in defense is where we need to go. Even a decade ago, it would have been a hard argument to put defense high on the list when seniors and healthcare and housing and so many other things were there. But although there's been movement and a lot more Canadians understand how our standard of living is tied into the defense of Western systems under attack all around the world, a lot of others really aren't there. So the government's in a tough place. I think what the government has to do is convince Canadians that we need to meet this academic requirement to show that we're serious about defense and get to 2%. Not the 4% gross domestic product that the Americans are investing or the 2.5% that the UK is investing, but 2%, significantly up from the 7.6 that we're supposed to be at the end of this decade. And the government's going to have to do it while bringing along these Canadians who have never really seen defense to be a priority. And I think there are ways to do that.
Okay, ways to do that. But, before we get there, what are the implications here, though, General? If we don't actually meet this 2%, what are the implications for Canada?
Yeah. Well, they could be as serious as this. If President Trump is elected again and carries through with some of his more radical ideas regarding NATO, we may see a unilateral withdrawal for simple reasons that other nations, along with Canada, have not kept up as they were supposed to. More likely not a withdrawal, but perhaps a two-tier NATO in which if you haven't ponied up your 2%, there is no guarantee by Article 5, that historical article in NATO's constitution, that one for all and all for one if someone's attacked. But really, even when we go short of these really significant, earth-shattering type things with that alliance, we see that around the world, Canada is seen to be a laggard and not really focused seriously on defense. Therefore, we're not being asked to take part in those really important things that we always were, the alliances, Five Eyes, sharing of information, that AUKUS that's been stood up with Australia, the UK, the United States. Those are things that we're not being asked to be part of anymore, simply because people have accepted the fact that Canada is not serious about defense.
General, quickly running out of time, but you mentioned being able to reach that goal more easily. What do you have in mind there? If you can say that quickly, please.
Well, yes. I mean, quite simply, if we were to develop a program, a really expensive program to purchase a fleet of subs, nuclear or conventional powered, then very quickly we would be at 2%. There are other ways to do it, systems for air defense and things like that. But I think there are ways where a lot of that money can stay in Canada. Refurbish the bases that we do have, and there's billions of refurbishment required because we've long allowed buildings on our wings and at our ports and our bases to languish. Fill the parts bins to get our ships sailing with more frequency, our aircraft flying with more frequency, and our tanks driving with more frequency. And then invest in those empty positions across the armed forces by really becoming competitive for young men and women in Canada to consider defense as a career for the future. So up the pay. It's pretty good right now. Up it to it's really good, and all that money stays in Canada.
General Lawson, always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thanks, Michael.
The federal government held a roundtable on artificial intelligence today, the hope being to get all government departments on the same page when it comes to regulating and using AI. It comes just days after the Trudeau government released a new strategy to protect government services from cyber threats. Well, to all of this, the Treasury Board President, Anita Anand, now joins us in studio. Minister, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
You know, when you talk about this push to improve cybersecurity, of course, it's not just the federal government. Many jurisdictions, many private companies are taking this on. But of course, the federal government has access to so much personal information of Canadians. I'm wondering, as we begin the discussion about cybersecurity, as your office also looks at artificial intelligence, has your office detected an increase in cybersecurity threats?
Yes, we have. Certainly after the illegal and unjustifiable further invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the number of cyber attacks from state and non-state actors has increased, making it even more important for us to have a unified strategy against cyber attacks and cyber threats for the Government of Canada. Of course, we have the Communications Security Establishment and Shared Services Canada who are doing excellent work in this area, but for the Government of Canada to have a unified strategy so that individual ministries are not pursuing their own types of defenses is extremely important at this time, giving everyone more comfort that their personal information is protected.
Well, you know, it's interesting because as you have this discussion, you know, almost parallel, there's also this debate right now about how often the public service needs to be reporting to work physically. And when we talk about cybersecurity, does the work from home model present a backdoor, if you will, for any negative actor, any bad actor to access government information?
No, those issues are always dealt with by the managers in place at the time. That is not something that has been at the heart of the change in policy from 2 to 3 days to 3 days in the office. Certainly we are taking a holistic approach to protecting government systems across the board in light of further threats and the changing global strategic environment.
I also want to ask about the talent pool that you have right now to actually deal with this, because as you said, you're trying to create this strategy where, you know, individual ministries, individual departments, that they're not acting independently but in tandem. And we're talking about a multi-million, multi-year project for your government. Is there the talent pool in the civil service right now to actually develop the type of policies for what is essentially a fast-changing environment?
It's an excellent question. We do need to hire more experts in the cyber and digital area, generally speaking. We are fully cognizant of the necessity to do that. We are decreasing the application process times to hire experts in this field. We're also putting in place a reskilling process so that individuals who want to impact and improve their skills in this area can do so. And I will say that we will continue to face competition from the private sector in terms of experts in this area. And so from a Government of Canada perspective, it is a matter of calibrating and continuing to hire more and more experts in this field.
Well, you know, and I appreciate it's not an easy task before any entity that's trying to create this type of policy. But at the same time, you know, your government faces a political reality where it's been criticized for using outside contractors. Does that hinder what you're trying to do here, the political criticism up against the real need to take on cybersecurity?
So we continue to reduce our reliance, generally speaking, on outside contractors. For example, in the supplementary estimates last year and again in the main estimates, I have reduced the expenditures on external contractors. It was about $350 million as a reduction in the last supplementary estimates before the holidays. That's just an example. So that work continues. That is part of the Refocused Government Spending Initiative that I am leading across government. And again, we are reducing overall our reliance on external experts. There are areas where external experts do add necessary value, such as in terms of statutory obligations or areas where we do not have the expertise in the public service. But I have published a manager's guide to third-party contracting now in 2 iterations to say to managers across the public service, where we have the expertise in the public service, we should be relying on the public service.
As we said right off top, there's 2 challenges essentially you're trying to take on: cybersecurity, the other one, artificial intelligence. Can you talk to us about the pitfalls? Because I know that there's the argument out there that AI can vastly improve times for government, the delivery of government services.
Yes.
But talk to us about the pitfalls, though, that you're concerned about.
Yes. We are seeing the necessity of improving the efficiency of government services and the productivity question across the country, including in the government. And so while we rely on digitization increasingly to ensure that those objectives are met, we do have to be cognizant of the possibility that I heard about this morning at our roundtable of experts on artificial intelligence, that there may be biases built in to artificial intelligence systems. And so I'm taking a very close look at potential harms that may result from the use of artificial intelligence, and at the same time ensuring that we develop a strategy for introducing it more broadly into the public service.
Okay, introduce more broadly, but also a limitation on how public servants use AI?
There are limitations already in terms of generative AI. It has to be approved by the managers and directors in particular departments, and certain areas would not be part of the use of AI in the public service where information is confidential, for example. But we need to develop a strategy that sees the risks and the possibilities of AI, generally speaking, outside of generative AI. And that's the purpose of the roundtable that I held with experts from across the country. Canada is a leader in AI. We were the first country to come out with a digital strategy and AI strategy in 2017, backed by $2 billion. We put another $2.4 billion behind AI in the private sector in budget 2024. And so the work work is being done to maintain Canada's leadership position in the area of AI while respecting the very real concerns relating to bias and other issues that might arise.
You know, I'm quickly running out of time, but I do want to ask you something, and it's not necessarily directed to AI and cybersecurity, but it's almost a fallout of it, because here we are quite essentially at a very angry time in the country. We've seen pushback on the vaccine mandates. We saw pushback on environmental policy. We see protests and signs across many neighborhoods in the country. Again, the federal government deals with so much information, personal information, and as the government becomes increasingly digitized, is there any thought being put forward about building public trust and having, I don't know if it's a formal campaign, informal campaign, to assure Canadians that as this information gets into government hands and is digitized, that they can feel secure about that?
It is a very real concern, and we need to ensure that we are building the public trust in democratic institutions, especially at this time. And so this concern about how do we do that? How do you build public trust? Public trust is not a tangible thing. It is something that comes with the ability to show that, for example, your information will be protected. And I have been working with the procurement specialists in our government and advocating for greater systems control over individuals' information, their private information. And at all times, we need to respect the obligations in privacy laws. That is first and foremost, so that individuals feel secure in their interactions with the federal government, and so that the innovations that we introduce take into account that priority first and foremost.
Minister, I always appreciate the time. Treasury Board Secretary, or President rather, Anita Anand, thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Well, the latest numbers from Abacus Data is showing very little movement in Canadian voting intentions. As it stands right now, Conservatives would have about 41% of the vote share, Liberals 25%, the NDP 18%, followed by the Bloc at 8% and the Greens at 4%. But beyond those numbers, we are getting a good idea of how Canadians are feeling about two of the party leaders in particular. And to talk about that, we're now joined by the founder, the chair, and the CEO of Abacus Data, David Coletto. David, good to see you.
Good to see you, Michael.
So when I talk about the two leaders, no surprise, you've done here almost a contrast and compare between the leader of the government, Justin Trudeau, the Liberals, and Pierre Poilievre, the Conservatives, leader of the opposition. You know, what's interesting here is that there's a wide difference in terms of voting intentions. But when it comes to grading those two leaders in particular, it seems that Canadians are giving them, you know, fairly equal grades, in particular when you talk about things like transparency, kindness, and being too extreme. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, and I think the whole exercise and how people are reacting to these statements shows us that even if they might be inclined right now to say, I'm going to vote Conservative, as you said, 16-point lead nationally, they look at these leaders in different ways. And I think that tells us a lot about, as we head towards the next election, what Canadians might be looking for. So, for example, you used the kindness factor, right? Here's one area where Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre are basically tied. Canadians are equally likely to think that that term describes both of them well or very well. Is too extreme, right? That would be oftentimes a criticism of Mr. Poilievre. I think Liberals are certainly trying to make him out to be that way, but they're more or less tied on that one as well, which tells you on both sides of the spectrum, people think the other leader is too extreme. And what I find really interesting is that third one hides their true views. Again, often Conservative leaders are the ones who are often described as having a hidden agenda. In this case, more Canadians think that Justin Trudeau's hiding what he really thinks about things than feel that way about Mr. Poilievre.
Yeah, interesting to see those impressions. But you know, those are the areas in which there seems to be greater similarity in terms of how Canadians will grade them. But you also looked at some other areas, and this is where there is a greater difference in areas like genuine care, competence, empathy for what Canadians are going through. What are Canadians saying about that?
Well, I think here we see where Mr. Poilievre has a big advantage over Mr. Trudeau, which I think explains why the Conservatives are doing so well. So on competence, right? Perhaps one of the core things we look for in a leader: who can run the country, who can solve problems. Mr. Poilievre has a 14-point lead. On who genuinely cares about Canada, something that I think you can objectively say Mr. Trudeau probably does care a great deal, but Mr. Poilievre has a 10-point lead on that, and then understands what life is like for you. This is the item in which Mr. Trudeau performs the worst. Only 25% of Canadians believe he does. You can see Mr. Poilievre well ahead on that one. And all of these, I think, start to paint a picture of the way in which the economic and social climate right now is affecting the way that we evaluate our political leaders. And so the biggest challenge facing Mr. Trudeau is not that people don't think he's a nice guy, is that they don't necessarily think he can solve the problems that they believe they're facing in their life and the country's facing as a whole.
Okay, let's pick up on that point, though, because if the numbers actually hold in terms of voter intentions, what we're talking about come the next election is a Conservative majority government. And you ask Canadians what they thought a Conservative government would do. Talk to us about what you found.
Yeah, so I think we're measuring perceptions in this case. And so what we learn is two things in particular stand out. The Conservatives have been very effective at priming, because they basically say it everywhere they go. They're going to axe the tax. They're going to get rid of the national price on carbon. 61% of Canadians believe they would do that. And you can see that there. Balancing the budget in 4 years. 34% think they'll do it. Half aren't sure that that's something they can accomplish. Make it harder to have an abortion. Right now, the Liberals are trying to push this issue, make people believe that. Right now, 41% believe that they would do that if they were elected, and that's only up slightly from when we asked this question back in December. So we haven't seen much change there. And perhaps the biggest challenge, I think, or one of the biggest liabilities for the Conservatives is on the issue of climate change. And you can see that only a third of Canadians think that the Conservatives would have a serious plan to deal with climate if they form government after the next election.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also got an expectation that a Poilievre government would end childcare, that they would end dental care programs. And when you ask more than 70% of respondents, though, they actually want, of the respondents you spoke to, 70% actually want the preservation of dental care and childcare programs. So if the expectation is that the Conservatives will cut those, and that's against what Canadians want as a majority, do you see those becoming potential wedge issues in the next campaign?
They are, and I think this kind of question is the perfect way to measure that, right? Because you're basically measuring what do Canadians want this government or any government to do, and you're right. A lot of the things the Liberals have done are quite popular: childcare, dental care. You know, I think people generally want climate action. They're not necessarily thrilled with the carbon tax itself, but they want a government to be serious on those, and they do not want people to make the government to make access to abortion more difficult. And so these are all issues right now where there is a gap. And I would say the biggest takeaway from all of this is that even though there's clear indications that people aren't happy with the Liberals, there are a lot of Canadians right now who say, I don't know what a Conservative government would do, or I'm inclined to think they're going one way or the other. And that's where, if you're the Liberals, that's an opportunity to start to frame what a Conservative government would actually do, perceptually, if they form the government, and they haven't yet done that, which is both an opportunity for the Liberals and, to some extent, a threat for the Conservatives.
Okay, well, you know, as I say, we've been watching these numbers for quite some time, with the Conservatives leading the Liberals, but to actually get into the nitty-gritty of policy, we'll, of course, talk a bit more about that as we approach a campaign, but very interesting numbers. David, thank you for that.
Thanks, Michael.
And that is Primetime Politics for this Monday. I'm Michael Serapio. We'll see you again tomorrow. Take care.